All right, welcome, welcome. We're live on YouTube as well. Really happy to reach everyone on YouTube as well as within this Zoom space for our Global Perspectives panel connected to This Wide Night for our designer panel. So super excited to be here this evening. We're going to get started in just a bit, maybe about 30 more seconds here while we get some people else to join on in, and then we're going to get this party started. Right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started with just our introductions over here and just our opening. And more people can probably enter in either through the Zoom or through YouTube. So again, happy and excited to have everyone who's going to be joining us for this panel. Again, this is a panel with the designers of the play This Wide Night, which is entering its final week of its performance, and just really thrilled that we've had a couple of panels already connecting the issues and themes of the play and hearing from experiences and hearing stories that have emerged from that. And here joining us this evening are two of the artists, the creatives behind this work, Georgette Verdon, the director of This Wide Night. And I'm going to pop in her information into the chat as well as share that with you. Georgette, so happy that you could join us this evening.
Yes, I'm thrilled to be here.
It's been a journey for you, as I can imagine, from just not even just from this year, but also through the pandemic with this play. So just really, we'll touch base on that as well later on. And we also have, very thrilled to have Soterios Lividitis with us, who is the set designer for This White Night. Soterios, welcome, welcome. So happy and thrilled to have you as well.
Thank you. Likewise, I'm happy to be here too.
And you are also a team that has worked together as well in other productions as well. So it's great to be able to bring this talented group together.
Thank you.
Before we go ahead and get started, just wanted to give an acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement. The performance takes place on the land of the Potawatomi, and so want to give an acknowledgement for the space that we are on. Also wanted to give an acknowledgement, a digital land acknowledgement, and I am going to give credit to Adrian Wong for this. But since our activities are shared digitally to the internet, let's take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many indigenous communities. Even the technologies that are central to much of the art we make leave significant carbon footprints, contributing to changing climates that disproportionately affect indigenous people worldwide. I invite you to join us in acknowledging all this, as well as our shared responsibility to make good of this time, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. So thank you for that moment. Snaps to that. I am also going to introduce myself. My name is Roel Mason-Vivet, and I am coming to you from Chicago as part of Mason-Vivet Consulting Group. And we're an organization that works with other organizations that are committed to furthering diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout their organization. So super thrilled to be with Georgette and Soterios, with Shattered Globe and Interrobang for this panel to talk about This Wide Night, as well as its connections to its topic of incarceration. So we're going to go ahead and get started here with our conversation. We're going to start off with a few questions, and if any questions come through that you'd like to either share through the chat, or we will open up later on for questions as well. But would love to just have you be able to see the conversation that takes place between Georgette and Soterios. So opening up with this first question, wanting to ask if each of you, Georgette and Soterios, can each of you share your personal connections to This Wide Night in terms of your why? So why were you drawn to this work? How did you come to learn about it? And why is it personally important to you?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. I first read the play in 2017, and it really just cracked me wide open. I mean, I think about theater as a sacred space. I think, the quicker our world moves, the more, we're connected to technology. I think the harder it can be to find those moments to sort of settle and check in with what's going on internally. And so theater is very much that for me, a time when I can kind of check in with my emotions and connect. And when I sat down with this play and read this story about these two women post-incarceration, I just was so moved by their, journey, really, and their relationship. And I knew that I had to direct this piece. I think as a director, I'm very drawn to pieces that that spread empathy and that make it, that help us bridge the gap between ourselves and people that at face value might seem very different than us. And I think This Wide Night does that really beautifully. It's such a specific story about reentry and what that experience looks like for people coming out of prison, and yet the emotions that are explored and the experiences are so universal. So yeah.
For me, I feel that the judicial system and its process has always been an interest of mine, even though it's not remotely close to at least not directly to the field I work in. I'm very intrigued by stories of our justice system in ways that it works, and even more specifically in ways that it falls short. And I feel that what drew me to this really wonderful play was that it very much not addressed, but it opened a conversation for to talk about the effectiveness of our justice system, especially in terms of incarceration. And it doesn't necessarily say this is what it should be, this is what it shouldn't be, but it opens up the conversation, even though it still has a very clear point of view about what is being presented. It's just a very beautiful slice of life without necessarily being heavy-handed in or offering some kind of a solution to it. It leaves so much open, it leaves so much pliable, and it really offers so many access points to experience it. It's a very human story. And you don't necessarily need to be an expert on the topic of mass incarceration or criminal justice to be able to appreciate the humanity behind the play. And to me, those are all things that I think plays at the core need to be about the human condition. And I feel that this one does this so beautifully, as well as opening up this really interesting and intriguing and important conversation about the role of incarceration within societies.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for naming that in terms of like the importance of being able to connect with humanity through this play. And one of the things that we've been able to experience in our previous panels is hearing the stories about the experience of incarceration as well as reentry from our previous panelists, which were really powerful. And it was an honor and privilege to hear those. I'm wondering if for you, have there been connections to incarceration or to reentry that you were able to tap into for this particular piece?
I can go first.
Yeah, sure.
None directly. As I mentioned before, the subject of criminal justice is an interest of mine, and one that I delve into with podcasts and documentaries that share firsthand experiences. Specifically, one is and I haven't listened to it in a while, but it deals specifically with people who have been wrongfully convicted. And a special case that came to mind when I first read the play was the Central Park Five. And for those who don't know, it's a case that happened, I believe, was it the 70s in New York, or was it much later than? Anyway, I should know more about it, but it happened in New York. It's also referred to as the Central Park jogger case, and 5 young teenagers were wrongfully convicted. And it has come up recently, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm confused about when it take place, because former President Donald Trump actually had a very active participation with the media frenzy of this case, which is one of the reasons why it's come up so much in recent years. But essentially what happened, 5 young boys, and I believe they were all young boys of color, were wrongfully convicted for the rape and near murder of a jogger through Central Park, which is why they refer to it as the Central Park jogger case. And I was watching a documentary about this, and they were interviewing one of the boys who was wrongfully convicted of this horrific crime. And when he got out, he was a young adult and had zero skill set because he had been incarcerated for most of his young adult life. Didn't have really any skill sets. No one would hire him because he had a record. And then his only means of accruing an income for himself was to go into crime. And that for him was a means of survival that was implemented because of the ineffectiveness of our justice system to correctly apprehend the people or the person who committed this crime, despite overwhelming evidence of that time. And so to hear that story about someone coming out, someone who had served their time, I believe that there's this misapprehension that life begins again with a blank slate once you do reemerge, and it's not. You're marred with this for the rest of your life. You have to describe it, you have to relive it. And I don't think it necessarily applies to the characters in This White Knight, because it is my point of view, and hopefully the same as Georgette's, considering that we did this play together, that both of these women did commit the crimes that they had been convicted of, even though it's not necessarily relevant. But in this particular case, people always say that, oh, it's a place for rehabilitation, and I just don't feel that it is. Or if it is, it's not nearly doing the work that I think it needs to do. And there's just this stigma that comes along with having been incarcerated, and in terms of how people look at you and how you work your way through the world, and having to confess this on job applications and college applications and all of the above. It sticks with you forever. But this notion that someone who had paid served their time were still unable to leave a meaningful, contributing to society life and legitimately make a life for themselves with that on their record. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's what that system should be there to do. It's just, so in terms of like my opinion of it feeling should be less shaming and more rehabilitating. And it's a complicated conversation, and one that I'm not an expert in. Of course, I'm a set designer for stage plays and musicals, but it's certainly something that I don't think you need to be an expert to open your heart and acknowledge the humanity behind this really interesting topic.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, I actually do have a connection to incarceration directly. And it's interesting, because I was thinking about this today. This didn't actually really come up in the room during the process, and I was trying to think about why, which I'll talk a little bit about. But my dad was actually incarcerated for like 9 years during my early childhood. And, I think this particular play to me is so much about women. And I think maybe that's why it didn't necessarily come up. I also think that there's something about like wanting to, or trying to be careful about not making it so much about my own story, so that there's room for everyone to kind of have their own entry into the play and bring things to the play that help us kind of build the world. But I mean, that is a personal connection. It's, I'm one of the sort of impacted, I grew up, I had a stepfather who was there, but, that's not the same as having your biological father, and not really being able to kind of process through as a child, what that experience is. I did go and like visit my dad in prison a couple times, and that's quite a strange experience, and especially for a young kid. And so there are, while I do feel somewhat removed from that, certainly I do have, personal experiences to draw on.
I think first, thank you for sharing that. And also like for both
Red
of you.
table talk.
There we go. We're getting into it now. We're really getting into it, diving deep. But I think part of this is what is also captured in the play is just that extension of the impact of incarceration to not just that single person, but to other family members. And then also, Satir, as you're talking about over time. Yeah. It's not just like it's finished at this time, but it extends. And that's something that definitely came up with our guest panelists from before in our previous panel, as well as like the real deep impact is it's not just impacting a few, it's far reaching with us. Wanting to just move a little bit more now into sort of like your creative process for this production, and how you had to take all of sort of your understanding, your research around like what the play is trying to communicate, and how do you design for that. So would just really love to like sort of enter into your heads around particularly around your I guess we could start off with your set design, your choice around how you wanted to create the space, and what was that about?
Sure. I mean, and with any set design, especially, working with Georgette, it's really more of a, like, it's not my set and her play, like the show is just ours. And ours extending, of course, to the other fantastic members of the creative team that we got to work with on this, and of course the incredible cast as well. And it begins as a conversation about themes. Whenever I talk to a director, I never like to say, door should go here, couch should go here, and it should be this color. We talk really more about the macro of the play, and I'm really more concerned about, because and to be blunt, I'm a much better set designer than she is, so I'll do that work, and she doesn't need to I want her to say yes or no, and I like this, or what if, and really more respond to things. But my immediate impulse, and this is when the production of this play was really, just a dream in Georgette's mind, and she passed along the script, and I read it, and of course it's been a long time since I had been that engrossed in a play, and a lot of times I find myself thinking like, I have to track the furniture and have to track everything else, and this one is just wholly consumed by these characters. And when I picked up the phone with Georgette again, I was like, "Are you thinking about doing this?" She goes, "I think I am." And I go, "Okay, well, here's what I think." And the first thing I told her was, I couldn't really justify it. It was a gut response that the play takes place in this floating box that just kind of floats above the stage, surrounded by negative space. And I don't know what that means. I don't know why, but it feels that that's appropriate. And then we started breaking that idea apart. We started talking about how it must feel so isolating to be out. And neither of these characters really have a parade of people waiting for them outside of prison with, with signs and banners saying, welcome back, like, no, they're on their own. They're given their stuff and, the door slams in their faces. So this feeling of loneliness and really the only person in the world was that person you had inside prison. So I think that's where the process began, having that image. And then when we, when the show became a thing and we all got signed on to do it, we just began with model making and thinking about, how it could be structured. But before that, the research we did was pretty in depth, because we not only wanted to do research on what apartments in this suburb of England looks like, but we also wanted to have an evocative response to it as well. So the two-pronged approach that we took to researching this play began with doing research on actual apartments in that area. And I usually, whenever I do something that takes place in a very specific living arrangement, I go as though I'm going to rent an apartment in that place. And I start looking around that neighborhood and starting to find ways to get inspired by those spaces, and just to understand the conventions and to find something that might hit. But the research that I found to be really beneficial, because even though it was really valuable finding those, the plethora of research of these bedsits in England, what really I think made a really big impact on us was because that research was lacking this textural quality. And then so I decided to take another avenue for the research, and I started looking at images of prisons in the UK and Europe, and that is where we really found that textural quality that I think the play needed and has, and I think that serves the play really well. Because one of the other things that we talked about after this feeling about this isolated box floating in space, we both kind of passed on to each other and agreed that the women are going from one prison into another, that they're not wholly free, which goes back to the thing we were talking about before, that it's a long-term, it's almost like you're always going to serve a life sentence. It's always going to follow you around everywhere, not just psychologically, but also just the practical legalities of who you have to share this to. And so the idea about that those elements and that texture and those textured walls and the griminess of it, and the one window room, and this followed us as we were in rehearsals of feeling like, okay, should the bathroom door just always be open so it always feels like it's one room? And in early models, we had divided the space up a little bit. The space was much more architecturally savvy than what it ended up being. And we just realized that, no, it's not like 3 rooms in one space, it's one space. And that, and that discovery was really important to us in realizing not just what the play looks like, but what the play feels like too, and what we want the audience to feel like, that it's never going to be this clean space that we can take care of. And then the next layer to that was thinking about, I was a psychology minor, so I approach design as always of people are products of their environment, and also vice versa. So if you look at it as a math equation, you think to yourself, this is the given circumstances of these characters, and then what is the space that creates the action that allows that to happen in? And that was just thinking about what is a type of place that Marie would live in, and how would Marie live? Because it's her, at the beginning of the play, it's her space. And so, we started carving in a bit of a backstory, and this was between Georgette and ourselves, and then the fabulous Isla ended up bringing this other wealth of her own artistry into what the space would then become. But we were just thinking about that she probably wouldn't know what to look for in a good apartment, or even what a good apartment looked like, or what to check for when she was in the apartment. So there's a lot of dilapidation. a lot of economic insinuation about where she is in that department, and thinking about, did she ever have the system taught to her of how to routinely clean and how to routinely take care of yourself and how to cook your own meals? And that's something we talked a lot about too, is about the life skills that you miss out on if you are in Christ, especially if you're in your youth. You know, everything that we have in our life is a system that we have learned, that we have put into place. And I feel that that's something that we really wanted to bring into the design. But I think we're just, you know, one of those things being like, at the very beginning, I said, I think that there's a dead plant. And Georgette asked why. And I go, I think that she really wants her life to be better, and that she has this idea that a plant will do that, but she doesn't know how to take care of it, so it dies. So one of the things that we had is just this little subtle gesture of this dying plant, trying to give her a little bit more agency that she wants her life to be better, but just doesn't really lack the skills on how to do that. And so things like that are all over the apartment. The plant is just one example, but those little details, especially in a play that I feel warrants realism, as a choice, and we made that choice early on. And it takes place in the theater, so of course it's abstracted realism, but yeah, that's a much more long-winded answer than I think any of us were expecting. But that was the approach to the design. Did you want to add anything to that, Georgette? Did I?
Nope. I think you covered
anything?
You covered it. You're very thorough. Thank you. No, it was great. It was great. It was a very yeah, you spoke our journey.
Well, Georgia, one of the things that I appreciate what Satirius was saying was like, he wanted to be able to bring something to you, and with your director's eye, be able to say yes, no, this. For you, like as you saw it come and become realized, what were some of the things that you saw from your eyes that were like, that sort of had it evolve over time, or problems or things that you were like, oh, we need to solve for, in terms of that, in terms of creating the experience that you were hoping for, that the audience would take from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is, you know, just what he was talking about, this idea of how architecturally interesting can the space, how can it be, should it be? For me, one of the things that felt really important about the play was this idea that there is no way to escape each other, you know, especially early on in the play when Marie is not feeling like she wants to have that space invaded. And, you know, Lorraine, I think, comes out and is feeling really terrified about how to, you know, get things started. And I think there's a real palpable fear. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on Marie. And so for me, I think the space had to feel as if there was no way to escape from each other. And that was something that felt really important to me. We spent quite a lot of time talking about like, how big can the couch be? I wanted the couch and the pull out, the fact that they have to sleep in the bed together. I wanted that to feel slightly, you know, uncomfortable. And I didn't want it to be this huge couch so that they could kind of have their separate spaces. I thought it was important that everything was just a little too close for comfort, you know, and, you know, obviously they were cellmates and they had to be in a smaller space together, but, you know, they're in new circumstances now. And so that was important to me. There was a lot that we kind of went back and forth about in terms of like the ground plan, just where, you know, like I remember an early conversation about, should there be a closet? Like, you know, and we ultimately liked the idea that no, there was like a cheap clothing rack that all of her stuff, you know, and just taking away that sense of, you know, having, you know, the ability to really, make the space homey, you know, that some of that should be taken away. And so we like the aesthetic of there being this clothing rack there where she just kind of, you know, everything kind of gets thrown into the corner, you know, and it never really feels like, you know, there's a suitcase at the bottom of the clothing rack and, you know, it's like she's there, but she can't really fully settle into
Yeah.
that space, and hopefully, I don't think the play is without hope. So hopefully she is on her way to something better, hopefully they both are, and hopefully they don't have to settle for what this kind of apartment represents right in this moment.
I
It has a
like how
much
you,
more, sorry, I was
oh,
going
no,
to
go.
add on, like,
Yeah.
the thing that I feel is successful about not just the play, but the design as well, is that it has a much more abstracted view for the emotional content of the play than going for something that is ultra realistic.
Mhm.
In theater, we're allowed to cheat a lot about how we want the play to feel, even though it may not be architecturally honest. And I feel that, that's something that Georgette and I was really important to us, that we had the freedom and the flexibility to do that.
Mhm.
And then using that kind of compressed space to capture both sort of like this, prison to prison kind of feel. But then Georgette, as you were alluding to hope, like there were elements of hope in there that I feel like signaled that they were in this space, but that they're also transitioning into something that, is not a condemnation or a judgment of like, this is it, we can actually move into something else. So
Right. And I think, not for nothing, but the moments of joy, and there are several moments of joy, moments where we see the relationship as it may have been when they were in prison and cellies and completely sort of reliant on each other. We still get those in this play, even though there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety and a lot of uncertainty about what their lives are at this moment. And that was something that Sandy and I spent a lot of time talking about, just how important it is that we allow the joy to come through, and that, that's something that's just remarkable about the human spirit, right? Like, even in the worst of conditions, we somehow find a way to have a laugh, or to share these little moments of joy. And that's also something that I think was just, beautifully kind of baked into the script. And that I'm just really proud of the way that, Isla and Linda really embodied that and kind of fully embraced that, because I think it's such a nice relief and release from some of the heavier things that the play is navigating.
yeah, I think that brings that fullness of humanity that I think, Satirius, you were talking about, was like people can connect to it at so many different levels.
Yeah.
One thing that's also happened in terms of like, there's a compression of space, but also this sense of time. It happens within like, the action is happening within like 6 days. And so just, and the actors were very, creative about how they also marked that and how it was shown. Like, what were some of your sort of design thoughts around that, or trying to show that evolution of time within the play?
I will credit esteemed, hugely respected colleagues on this one, and that's Labisa, who did who's our costume designer, and then Trey, who did the lighting design. And I feel that the specificity of those clothes, especially for a contemporary dress show, goes overlooked so often. But there's such mastery in the very specific details that they both brought into it. And I'm sure Georgette will be able to talk much more about it, but I have to credit them with the success in terms of tracking that passage of time, because the space does change a little bit, in the sense that with clever transitions that were discussed between not just Georgette and myself, but also our fantastic props designer, Ray Watson, about how the passage is more about the invasion of Lorraine, and not the invasion, but the insertion of Lorraine into Marie's space, and how design helps show that Lorraine is becoming more and more comfortable in that space. But I do feel that the passage of time, design-wise, was much more attributed to those artists as well. So I just want to give them that credit.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's so true. I mean, you know, the costumes were quite the thing. You know, it's interesting because there's, you know, Lorraine, who really doesn't change at all, you know, throughout the course of the 6 days. And I just kind of is hunkered down. Well, she does change when she's, you know, around the bin when she gets the, you know, the gift of the shirt. But we have Isla constantly changing, you know, as Marie, and also sort of navigating this sort of outside world. And that was something that we spent quite a lot of time talking about with Lavisa, that we spent quite a lot of rehearsal time working out, because, you know, there's 11 scenes, and, you know, we did want to kind of mark through the changes, and when Marie was going out, you know, there's definitely, you know, the suggestion that she's participating in sex work. And so that, you know, how do we kind of, you know, how does dress come into that?
Mhm.
You know, and so we spent quite a lot of rehearsal time working out, you know, how that was going to operate, and how it could also happen on stage as well. And, you know, we had the costume rack, or the clothing rack where all of her clothes lived. You know, we felt like, because of the intimacy of the relationship, it felt right that they could change, you know, that Marie would change, you know, in front of Lorraine. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, you know, for me, time was something that was very important, and we did talk about it quite a lot, because we had to kind of track what was happening between scenes. But at the end of the day, there's also something that I think, you know, Lorraine says early on in the play, you know, time flies, you know, it feels different on the outside. And I think there is something to that. Like, how does time feel when you're incarcerated? And you'll hear people who have been incarcerated talk about how much more they sleep just to try and pass the time, because the days feel so long, you know. And then what does it feel like to be out, kind of living your life? And yet here, these two women are kind of living very disconnected lives, like not having that community. So there is still some sense, I think, that the days are really long, you know, and kind of drawn out. So in some ways, you know, the way that we kind of worked in rehearsal, the specificity and with the designers of time was very important. But I don't know that it was all that important in how people were perceiving the show, if that made sense. You know, it was important for us to track through what was happening and what was going on. But I ultimately, you know, whether you thought it was 6 days or 2 weeks or a month, I don't necessarily think changes necessarily anything about the experience of the show. But it's really interesting, just that whole concept of time in relation to incarceration in general.
You brought up. Oh no, go ahead.
I just want to add on to something of what Georgette was saying about whether or not people noticed or it was important to them, and I firmly believe, and this did come up. I remember a phone conversation between our lighting designer Trey, Georgette, and myself, of saying that, yeah, they won't, like, the thing about stage design, it's a tricky thing, because a lot of the stuff, if it is done well, will not go noticed, you know, or will go unnoticed. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore it, because they know it, even if they don't know that they know it.
Yeah, it works on you on a subconscious level, right?
It
kind of just washes over you, and it's there underneath everything.
So ignoring those conventions of time of day and whatnot, I just think it's important to not do that, to acknowledge that and to be aware of that, and to make those specific choices, because it's still a part of, yeah, you may not be looking at your watch, but you know it's about early afternoon because of the way the light hits the window. And that's important. And the way, I mean, there's this beautiful costume piece of this so I would say a fancier coat that Isla wears, which is, you know, she takes out one night in this transition that Georgette designed really beautifully. And then when she comes back wearing that same coat, we know what's happened because the light's not flooding through the window. We know it's the next morning, and she's wearing the same thing she was wearing last night. And so tracking those choices is very important, and understanding, because I think what happens outside the apartment is also just very important in how the story gets told. And giving your audience as much as they can while still engaging their imaginations is important in that. So a lot of those decisions go into design, even though they're not scenic, which is my area. I've come to become very aware and very grateful for those very subtle but important choices that design has on storytelling.
Well, and a huge credit to Isla too, just, that because she had so many changes to navigate in between scenes, and yet there is so much of what Marie is going through that is happening outside of that room, and how that gets brought into the space with her and Lorraine. I think that Isla just did a lovely job, and it's, I think, a huge feat to be able to navigate all of those kind of logistical things of like changing and yet really kind of keeping that emotional journey going and staying connected, right? And being able to kind of connect the dots between what's happened outside and what you're walking into the door with, what you're walking into the room with, and how that changes how you relate to that other person in the room.
It's a juggling act. Oh, yeah.
Well, I just love how you both mentioned all the elements that had to come together to make that work in terms of what was set up for the actors in that space, but then also for them and what they did in that.
Yeah.
It's also grateful because it was just a very collaborative room, and that I just remember, the costume designer, we were having some, without going into too much details because I just don't think it's interesting, but we were having some issues with the colors of the walls, and Lavisa, I'd never not worked with before, just felt very comfortable coming and sitting next to me, saying the walls are looking like, they're meshing with the skin tone of one of the actors, and they're kind of like not disappearing. It's not like it's a vanishing act, but it's something that, how can we make them stand out more? And it became another conversation that made the design better. And some rooms, artists just don't feel like they want to encroach on other people's discipline. And I'm not like that at all. And I'm not going to go and give other designers notes because that's not my job. But the collaboration, just for me, it's so much better when it exists. And when you feel entitled enough to talk to the other artists in the room, to have those conversations, because I think a lot about space, whereas the costume designer is thinking more about the individual actors and how they're coming off in the space as well. So when we can have that conversation together, we learn so much, and we can piggyback on each other's ideas in this really beautiful way. And that happens so much in this room, and I'm really, truly grateful for it. The communication was just open. Everyone was really nice and constructive, but also direct as well, which I appreciate. So it was a really healthy cultivation of ideas, which is great.
Agreed.
Well, this production also came about in the midst of, within the context of the pandemic, and even leading into it. And I would also say the dual pandemic of COVID, as well as the struggle for racial justice. And I'm just curious, did you find that the pandemic, both either impacted sort of the work, or informed you or created changes or things that you're thinking about in terms of the creative work?
Well, I think both in talking with Sandy Shatterglobe's artistic director, when I picked the play back up again, it was very much the pandemic that made me feel like now might be the right time to do this show. I think for me, again, I think these women can, or people who have been tied up in the criminal justice system can so easily be othered. And I think, and yet again, the journey and the emotional landscape of these characters is so relatable, and we've all, we're all just struggling for love and belonging, and a sense of connection. And And yet, during the pandemic, we've had the rug pulled from under us. We haven't, things that we thought were certain no longer were. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety and a lot of isolation and disconnectedness that the pandemic brought, a lot of uncertainty about the future. And so I felt like, even though I think the play does a beautiful job, and it's really hard for me to think about anyone watching this play at any time, if done well, and not having empathy for these women, it seemed like right now there were new access points into the play, that there were things that, that we all could relate to, and the fact that we could all relate to them, the fact that globally, like, that we all were experiencing the same sorts of things, I thought was really powerful, and was, a really important reason to bring this play now, So
I think that the immediate instinct that we had, that I shared earlier about, this fully realistic replete apartment in this floating box surrounded by negative space, and as this image that is taking us into discovering the play, had just as much to do with the emotional response to the play as it did the fact that the creative artists involved with it had been isolated from each other physically for a big chunk of time, and which isn't something that I had experienced before, certainly, about mandated to stay inside. I think sometimes in Chicago, if there's like a polar vortex, we're told to stay indoors, but like never upon the threat of contracting a deadly virus. And I think that in terms of I feel like responded more to the racial reckoning that we had during the pandemic, and mostly because I feel that what that moment in our history was asking us was to channel our empathy in a more direct way. And I think that in introducing us to these two characters who had both done something horrible, or subjective, of course, but like who had both committed a crime, and had been to this place where only the bad people go, were forced to click on or turn up our empathy, and we're forced to realize that, I do have privilege, and this is what privilege actually looks like. It's not just directly to wealth, which I think is a misconception that so many people have. Whereas now we're being asked to look at empathy differently in terms of the way that we just walk through life, and acknowledging our own biases within that. And I don't think you can read this play without addressing that within yourself, about how you look at someone who was who had been incarcerated before. And I remember one time, I have a very dear friend who introduced me to someone she was seeing, and then revealed to me later that that person was on the sex offender registry. And that made my heart jump, and here's someone I know, who I care about, who I want to feel love and romance and all that. And when I found out what this person had done, which I don't feel like comfortable sharing, it really wasn't nearly as aggressive or violent as what you might thought when you say, I know someone who's on the sex offender registry. It was a far more benign crime. But if it wasn't for that introduction, the channel of empathy would not have been opened. And I feel that what happened this last summer, following the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that we've been having, it's forced all of us to open up our empathy to a wider, more appropriate scope for what America actually is made up of. So I think those two things very much heavily influenced how we saw this play and how we rendered it in a physical, visual space.
Yeah. And certainly it asks us to look at the systems, a lot of the research that I in how systems fail people, right? And, a lot of the research that I did, I have this book here that I read, and it was, it's called Inside This Place, Not of It. And it's these narratives from women who have been incarcerated, some are currently incarcerated, some have, have gotten out. And it just, was just unbelievable, the amount of times and systems that have failed these women in order to lead them to where they were and into prison. And I think that that's something that we say, oh, you've been incarcerated, you've done something wrong, but the issues have far more nuance than that, and it's so important that we hear people's stories. I think stories are really transformative, and they give us context, right? And it kind of takes it out of this sort of, it pulls us away from kind of statistics and more kind of sterile facts, and kind of plops us into a world, and kind of going through and sort of recognizing what these women experienced before they ever got to prison, how they got to prison, what they had to endure while they were in prison, and then what they continued, the uphill battle that they had after they got out of prison is just like completely mind-blowing and horrific. And I just, so I think thinking about systems too, and the way that systems fail people, and, again, like sort of going from one prison into this more invisible prison where you can't get employment, where coming, even finding a place to get housed right out of prison is so incredibly difficult. And I know one of the things Jakisha talked about when she met with the cast during rehearsal was, how you're kind of handed a piece of paper with some resources that half the time aren't even actual resources, because no one's vetted them, and they say that they hire formerly incarcerated individuals, and then you show up and they laugh in your face, and they're not doing that, or you're asked to work under really, harmful conditions that other members of society wouldn't be asked to work in those same conditions. So
Thank you sharing that, and just the learning that happens from being a part of that story and being so engrossed the experience of being with this wide night. And then also the importance of what you just said about the importance of hearing each other's stories is just so I think that's something that's going to like stay through this production, way beyond when it closes, just that reminder of the importance of that, as well as the voices that we also heard from our previous panels. And how can we continue that practice and cultivation of empathy, and also just that critical look at what are the structures and systems, and what is our role in that. So definitely like feeling both of those from this production, and sort of and your masterful genius behind creating that for all of us in this space.
It was a team effort.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation tonight, for sharing just your brilliance in bringing to life this production. And this wide night will be taking place. We have what, four more shows left?
4 more shows. Please come and see it. Yes.
So Thursday, Friday.
Friday at 8.
And Saturday 3 and 8 as well. So
that's right.
If you haven't seen it, please come on out and be so moved. And if you've seen it, be moved again. I've been out there twice seeing this, so it's just amazing.
Awesome.
So thank you.
Great.
Thank you both.
Thank
you so much.
Is there a Q&A or no? Are we done? Oh,
I think. I think we're all set.
Okay.
So yeah, I
Awesome.
just wanted to, I was gonna
Yeah.
see if we're all good. Okay,
Thanks for everything, Roel.
thank you so much, Satirius.